I lost my job, my friends, my reputation, all because of him. But he made one mistake, underestimating me. I used to think kindness could fix anything, that if you listened long enough, gave people the benefit of the doubt, or forgave them one more time, they'd eventually become better. My name is Lena Brooks. I'm 27, and for the last 5 years, I've worked as a social worker in Portland, Oregon. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. Every day I met people who'd hit rock bottom: addicts, runaways, ex convicts, broken families, and I tried to help them stand again. My colleagues called me the girl who helped everyone. I guess they meant it kindly, though sometimes it felt like a warning. I wasn't naive, or at least I didn't think I was. I knew people lied, manipulated, used pity like currency. But even then, I believed there's always a piece of goodness left inside each person, just hidden under layers of pain. That belief defined me, and eventually, it destroyed me. Most evenings after long shifts at the center, I'd walk home past the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, and for a few minutes, I'd let myself believe the world was softer than it really was. My apartment was small, the walls thin enough to hear my neighbor's TV, but it was mine. A quiet space after too many broken voices. My friends used to tell me I carried everyone's burdens like trophies. "You can't save the world, Lena," they'd say over coffee. "You'll drown before they do." I'd laugh, shrug, and answer, "Maybe, but at least I'll go down trying." Then one rainy Tuesday in late March, a new case landed on my desk. Daniel Reed, 33 years old, recently released from state prison after serving 4 years for financial fraud. His file was thin, just the basics. No family, no current employment, parole conditions listed in neat government handwriting. I read his intake form twice. There was a note from a supervisor: highly intelligent, manipulative tendencies, maintain clear boundaries. I smiled when I saw that. They wrote something like that on half the files we got. Clear boundaries were supposed to protect you, but no one really taught us how to build them. When Daniel first walked into my office, he didn't look like any of my usual clients. Tall, well groomed, dressed in a clean button down and worn leather shoes. His eyes were sharp but calm, the kind that made you feel seen. He shook my hand firmly and said, "You must be Miss Brooks. They told me you're the one who actually cares." Something in his voice, steady, warm, made me forget for a moment that this was just work. He told me he wanted to change his life, start a small business, prove he wasn't the man people thought he was. I listened, nodding, writing notes I didn't really need. His words carried that perfect balance of vulnerability and pride that I'd seen in people who almost believed in redemption. When our first session ended, he thanked me sincerely. "You have no idea how much this means," he said. "After prison, people look at you like you're trash. You, you don't." That night, I thought about his words more than I should have. I told myself it was just empathy, professional curiosity. But maybe it was something deeper, a small spark of hope that I could help someone truly rebuild. Over the next few weeks, Daniel came regularly. He was always polite, attentive, open. He talked about his mistakes without excuses, about how greed ruined him, how he wanted to make things right. He even started volunteering at a local shelter, which I arranged. The reports from the shelter staff were positive. Slowly, I let my guard down. One Friday afternoon, as he was leaving, he paused by the door and said, "You know, Lena, you're the first person who's ever believed in me." It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. When he smiled, it wasn't the smirk of a con man. It was warm, almost boyish, the kind of smile that made you want to believe everything he said. And I did. I didn't know it then, but that moment, me standing there with a folder in my hands and a soft smile on my face, was the beginning of everything. The beginning of the end of the girl who helped everyone. It's strange how quickly people can slip into your routine. Daniel became part of mine without me even realizing it. Every Wednesday at 3, he'd sit across from my desk, hands folded neatly, voice calm and measured. He had a way of making even silence feel intentional, like everything he said had been carefully chosen to sound sincere. I told myself it was just part of his charm, a side effect of years spent learning how to survive. Still, I started to look forward to those meetings more than I should have. Not in a romantic way, at least not then. More like relief. Most clients came in angry or hopeless. Daniel was composed, grateful, articulate. It was easy to believe he was really trying. He talked about guilt, how it ate at him, how prison changed him. He mentioned books he'd read, people he'd hurt, plans he wanted to rebuild. I don't want to be the man who ruins things anymore. Yeah, he said once. I want to fix them. It sounded rehearsed, but I wanted it to be true. One afternoon, after a long day filled with shouting matches and paperwork, I stopped by the community center cafe. Daniel was there, sitting alone, reading a newspaper. He smiled when he saw me, stood up politely. Hey, Miss Brooks, he said. Didn't think you came to this side of town. I almost corrected him. Lena is fine, but stopped myself. Professional distance. Always professional. I ordered coffee and he asked if he could join me. I hesitated, then nodded. He talked about how hard it was finding work as an ex convict. You'd think paying for your mistakes would count for something, he said with a bitter laugh. Turns out it only buys you more suspicion. I told him to keep trying, offered a few job leads, gave the usual encouragement. But as he spoke, I noticed how easily he switched tones. Vulnerable, then confident, then self deprecating. Like a man who knew exactly what emotion worked on people. When I got home that night, I felt uneasy. Not afraid, just uncertain. Something about him didn't fit neatly into the picture I'd built. He was too polished, too precise. But then again, maybe that was progress. Maybe I just wasn't used to seeing someone actually trying. A week later, I got a call from my supervisor, Karen. She wanted an update on Daniel's case. He's charming, isn't he? She said, half joking. Just remember, charm isn't the same as change. I promised her I was being careful. That same day, Daniel brought me a small plant for my office, a simple green fern in a clay pot. For all the lives you grow back to life, he said. It was corny, sweet even. I kept it on the windowsill. Later, I caught myself glancing at it while writing reports, thinking about how rare it was for clients to show gratitude. Most just vanished once they got what they needed. But Daniel, he seemed different. Or maybe I just wanted him to be. The first real warning sign came 2 weeks later. The center received an anonymous call claiming one of the social workers was too personally involved with a client. The caller didn't leave a name, just a cold, measured voice describing unethical behavior. Karen called me into her office, concern in her eyes. It's probably nothing, she said, but keep your distance from Reed for a while, all right? I agreed, though the accusation stung. Someone had twisted kindness into suspicion. When Daniel came in that afternoon, I told him about the complaint. He looked genuinely hurt. Do you think it was me? He asked softly. I'd never do something like that, Lena. You're the only one who ever treated me like a person. I wanted to believe him, so I did. I told him it wasn't his fault, that people were cruel, jealous even. And when he smiled, sadly, gratefully, it felt like I was defending something pure. But later that night, lying awake, a thought crossed my mind. If it wasn't him, who else would care enough to make that call? The plant sat by my window, green and perfect. I stared at it for a long time. Somehow it looked less like a gift and more like a reminder. For the next few weeks, things settled into an uneasy rhythm. Daniel still came to his sessions, still spoke gently, still looked at me as if I were the only person who hadn't given up on him. But something in the air had changed, just slightly. Like a note in a song that's almost right, but not quite. He started asking personal questions. At first, harmless ones. Where I grew up, if I liked my job, whether I had family nearby. Then deeper ones. If I lived alone, if I'd ever been married, if I ever felt lonely doing what I did. I'd laugh it off, steer the conversation back to him, but he always found a way to circle back. People like you must get tired, he said once. Always giving, never taking. It sounded like concern, but it wasn't. It was a test, one I didn't realize I was taking until much later. At work, I told myself I was handling him well. He was a client, not a friend. But the truth was, he made me feel seen. And for someone like me who spent her life listening to others, being truly seen was a dangerous kind of comfort. One evening, I stayed late finishing reports. The building was quiet, most of the lights off. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. It was Daniel. Sorry, he said quickly. I was just dropping off some paperwork. Didn't mean to scare you. He smiled, holding out an envelope. Inside were neatly filled job applications, legitimate ones. I thanked him, relieved, and walked him to the door. You shouldn't be here after hours, I said lightly. He grinned. Neither should you. The next morning, there was a coffee cup on my desk. Black, no sugar, exactly how I took it. No note, no name. I assumed someone from the team left it, but when I mentioned it, no one knew what I was talking about. It kept happening. Little gestures. A box of my favorite granola bars. A keychain with a small silver feather. My favorite symbol, though I'd never told anyone that. Coincidences, I told myself. But coincidences start to feel intentional when there are too many. Karen noticed my unease during a staff meeting. You okay? She whispered after. Yeah, I lied. Just tired. I didn't want to give Daniel the power of acknowledgement, because that's what it felt like. Power. Like every small kindness was a string, and I was the puppet pretending not to feel the pull. A few days later, he came in looking upset. I had an interview, he said, voice trembling. They didn't even let me finish. As soon as they saw my record, they shut me down. I tried to comfort him, to explain that it would take time. But he suddenly looked at me, eyes sharp, and said, You have no idea what that feels like, do you? To be judged for something you can't undo? It hit me like a slap. For a moment, I saw the man beneath the charm, the frustration, the bitterness. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. He apologized, smiled softly, and said he was just tired. I told him it was fine, that I understood. But inside, a small alarm had gone off. That night, I wrote his name in my notebook and circled it twice. Not out of fear, but focus. Because something about Daniel Reed wasn't just broken, it was deliberate. And the scariest part? He knew exactly how to make brokenness look like innocence. It happened so gradually that I didn't even realize I was being drawn in. Daniel stopped acting like a client. He began speaking to me like an equal, someone who understood him in a way the world never could. He'd linger after our sessions, offering to carry my files, to grab me coffee, to make things easier. I told him not to, but he always found small ways to help. When I stayed late at the office, he'd somehow appear at the exact moment I was leaving. "Just making sure you're safe," he'd say, that calm, steady smile never faltering. I should have reported it, but part of me, an embarrassingly human part, felt touched. After years of being the caretaker, someone was finally worrying about me. One evening, a storm rolled through the city. The rain fell hard and thunder cracked across the skyline. I was closing up when I saw Daniel waiting under the awning outside. No umbrella, soaked but smiling. "Your car's not starting," he said. "Figured you might need a ride." I froze. He shouldn't have known which car was mine. "How did you—" "I've seen you leave before," he said quickly, almost apologetic. "Didn't mean to scare you." I should have refused. I should have called a cab, but it was late and the rain was relentless and I was tired of always doing the right thing. So I got in his car. He drove carefully, keeping the conversation light. Music, weather, his progress with job hunting. I started to relax, almost forgetting the discomfort. But then, at a red light, he said quietly, "You don't realize how different you are, do you? Most people look at me like I'm broken. You look at me like I still matter." It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way he said them. Too soft, too intimate. When I didn't respond, he smiled faintly. "Don't worry, I know the boundaries." I stared out the window until we reached my street. Before I could thank him, he leaned slightly closer. "I just want you to know," he said, "I'd never hurt you." The next morning, I came into work earlier than usual, hoping to clear my head. Karen noticed something in my face immediately. "Did something happen?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, I'm just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was scared. I tried to create distance, scheduling his appointments with other staff, changing my commute routes, even asking the receptionist to screen his calls. For a few days it worked. Then came the emails. They started friendly, professional, then warmer, then different. "You said I should keep trying." "I am. You make me want to be better." "Do you ever think about me when I'm not there?" "I think you do." I blocked his address, but new ones appeared. Always polite, never threatening, but heavy with implication. Karen suggested we contact his parole officer, but I hesitated. "If we overreact, it might escalate him," I said. The truth was, I didn't want to believe it had come to that. I still wanted to believe he could stop. Then, one night, I woke to a sound outside my window. A faint scrape, then silence. I froze, holding my breath. When I looked out, the street was empty, except for a small object on my doorstep. It was the silver feather keychain he'd given me, bent and scratched. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I filed a formal report. The center suspended his access to all programs. His parole officer was notified. I told myself it was over. But that evening, as I was locking my door, I found an envelope tucked into the frame. My name written in neat, controlled handwriting. Inside was a single line: "You made me believe in you, and now you're gone." I remember sinking to the floor, heart pounding. That was when I realized the truth. Daniel wasn't looking for help anymore. He was looking for control. It started with an email, a short formal message from HR. "We need to speak with you regarding an internal investigation. Please come to the office tomorrow morning." At first, I thought it was a mistake. I hadn't been at the company for months. Not since Daniel and I ended both our relationship and our work together. But the tone of that message, the sterile politeness of it, made my stomach twist. The next morning, I sat across from two people in suits I barely recognized. They had files, folders, and expressions that made it clear this wasn't about a simple misunderstanding. They began showing me documents, project reports, invoices, and internal communications, all carrying my signature, my name, my credentials. Except I hadn't written any of them. One file contained a client's confidential information, leaked without authorization. Another showed a forged approval for a transaction worth thousands of dollars. And every trace pointed back to me. I could barely breathe. This isn't me, I whispered. I didn't sign these. I left months ago. The man across from me adjusted his glasses. The digital trail leads to your credentials, Ms. Miller. Your old access codes were used. Your email sent the files. That's when I realized this wasn't a random error. This was Daniel. He'd always been careful, meticulous. I'd watched him handle company accounts like a magician, erasing trails, encrypting data, always a step ahead of everyone else. And now he'd use that same knowledge against me. My phone buzzed that evening with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Lena, came his voice, calm, almost gentle. I didn't want it to come to this. I froze. You did this, I hissed. I had to, he said. You were about to expose me. You think you understand how this world works, but you don't. You still believe in fairness. That's cute. My chest tightened. You used my name to commit fraud. You destroyed everything I built. He chuckled softly. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet, but I couldn't let you ruin me. Then the line went dead. For days after that call, I lived in a fog, a blur of police visits, interrogations, and endless paperwork. My bank account was frozen, my professional license suspended. Even friends from the office stopped answering my messages. News spread fast. Lena Miller accused of data breach and financial misconduct. My name was suddenly linked to things I couldn't even pronounce. And Daniel? He'd vanished, deleted his socials, resigned before anyone could question him. I tried explaining to the investigators that he'd manipulated the system, that he'd set me up. But there was no proof. Every trail they followed led back to me. Nights were the worst. I'd wake up gasping, convinced I heard a knock at the door, expecting another officer, another accusation. I'd sit there, staring at the walls, wondering how I could have loved someone capable of this. I replayed every memory. The small red flags I ignored, the way he sometimes tested boundaries at work, how he smiled when he got away with bending rules. I thought it was confidence. It was calculation. Weeks passed before I realized the full extent of his betrayal. He hadn't just ruined my career. He'd stolen my identity to create new accounts, move money, and sign deals under my name. He'd built an entirely new life out of the ashes of mine. I was left with nothing but debts, suspicion, and the haunting knowledge that the man I loved had planned this long before I even saw it coming. But if Daniel thought this was the end of me, he was wrong. Because that night, as I sat in my dim apartment surrounded by letters from lawyers and investigators, I stopped crying. I stopped feeling sorry for myself. Instead, I opened my laptop, started a new document, and began listing everything I remembered about him. Every password, every client, every careless secret he'd ever shared. He'd taken my name, my future, my peace. Now I was going to take his life apart piece by piece. Losing everything doesn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happens in small collapses, doors closing, messages unanswered, opportunities evaporating, until you stand in a quiet room that used to belong to you and wonder how it slipped away. After the hearings, the center put me on administrative leave. The board sent a legal sounding statement. Pending investigation, Ms. Miller's duties are suspended. My inbox filled with automated messages about paused benefits and frozen payroll. The suspension felt like a public verdict. Someone uploaded a screenshot of a forged email to a neighborhood forum. The caption read, "Do you still want someone like this working with vulnerable people?" Within hours, strangers who had never met me were commenting, judging, declaring me guilty. People I had helped, parents I'd sat with while they cried, terrified teenagers I had convinced to keep going, replied with cautious, perfunctory messages at best. The morning shows called. Reporters wanted statements. I declined. What could I say that wouldn't sound like denial? The presumption of innocence had been exchanged for the presumption of guilt. My phone, once full of warm messages and case updates, buzzed instead with cold inquiries. Is this true? Did you forge this? Friends made excuses. Some said they couldn't be seen with me until things cleared up. Others stopped answering altogether. The particular silence from former colleagues, an avoidance that felt like a betrayal deeper than any headline, hurt most of all. Institutions protect themselves. People are frightened. That didn't make the sting any smaller. Practical things crumbled. I lost my supervisory role. My professional license was suspended pending a forensic audit. The housing application I'd been approved for fell through because the background check now showed pending investigation. Landlords are risk averse, employers even more so. The fraud had ripple effects I hadn't imagined. For months, I worked like a woman possessed. I met with lawyers who counseled patients and collected documents. I spent nights on hold with banks and credit agencies trying to block accounts and clear my name. Every step forward felt like wading through molasses. I'm doing the right thing, I told myself at 3 in the morning as I printed another bank statement. But paper couldn't breathe life back into my reputation. Daniel had been surgical. He used burner accounts, routed transfers through shell corporations, and accessed systems with credentials timed to point to me. Whenever I found a thread, it unraveled into more complexity. IP addresses tracing to VPNs, email headers pointing to proxy services. He'd anticipated investigators and anticipated me. There were moments of hope. A trainee who recalled Daniel working odd hours, a clerk who remembered a misplaced paper file. Each promising lead dissolved under the weight of skilled obfuscation. Evidence evaporated. Witnesses doubted their memories. The pattern Daniel had engineered looked like chaos instead of design. Humiliation was bureaucratic as well as public. I sat in cold rooms answering the same questions while faces behind glass recorded everything. My references withdrew. Offers evaporated because the word accusation painted me untrustworthy. Months stretched. I lost not only my job, but the ordinary scaffolding of daily life. The coffee shop that knew my order, the colleagues who dropped by my desk. The facade of normalcy peeled away until the world outside felt unfamiliar. But under the cloak of that collapse, something hardened. I stopped waiting for someone else to fix the mess. The months of trying and failing taught me how he thought, what loopholes he used, which systems could be pried open, where to look next. When people asked if I regretted helping him, I couldn't bring myself to say no. Regret and resolve lived together inside me. I had loved the idea of redemption. Daniel had weaponized it. The fall was brutal, but it gave me one thing a witch hunt can't take: knowledge. The world didn't end after the scandal, it just went quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like air before a storm. For months, I lived in that silence. My name was still tainted, the investigation technically open, though everyone had already decided I was guilty. I learned to exist in the background. Small apartment, quiet streets, no eye contact. I waited tables at a cafe that paid cash, used a prepaid phone, and smiled when people didn't recognize me. That silence at first was unbearable, but slowly it became something else: focus. I stopped thinking about redemption. I stopped explaining. I stopped hoping Daniel would ever face justice through the same system he'd corrupted. What was left of me, the soft parts, the empathy, the trust, burned away. What remained was sharp. I started to research. At night, I sat on the floor with my old laptop, piecing together fragments of his life. He had vanished officially. No social media, no professional listings, nothing traceable. But men like Daniel didn't disappear. They changed skins. I began with what I remembered: the companies he'd bragged about, his former clients, the people he'd called useful. I traced his digital ghost: fake domains, deleted accounts, archived press releases. One link led to another until I found a name that caught my eye: Elias D. Warren. A consulting profile, clean, respectable. But the writing style in the bio was Daniel's. That same smug confidence dressed as professionalism. I stared at the screen for hours before whispering aloud, "Found you." From there, I built a map: contacts, cities, timestamps. He had relocated under that alias, working through a boutique firm that specialized in high risk negotiations. The irony made me smile. Daniel was still profiting from manipulation. But what fascinated me most wasn't the new name. It was a pattern of small payments made to a private account in Miami. The recipient? A woman named Clara Jensen. I didn't know her, but something about the timing felt deliberate. Payments every 2 months, same amount. I dug deeper. Public records showed Clara had once been a financial consultant and years ago had been accused of embezzlement. The charges had quietly disappeared. That was when I knew. Daniel hadn't only done this to me, he'd done it before. I found a blog she'd written years earlier under a pseudonym, where she mentioned a man who stole my work and left me to take the fall. Her posts were vague, almost like therapy entries, but the details were too familiar. Same manipulation tactics, same emotional dismantling. I tracked down an old email from her professional profile, sent a short message. "I think we were both victims of the same man. I just need to ask you one question." For days, nothing. Then one night, a reply: "If his name was Daniel, don't trust him. And don't go near him unless you're ready to lose everything again." I stared at that message for a long time. It didn't scare me. It clarified something inside me. Daniel had built his life on people like us, women who believed in him, who tried to fix him, who didn't see the knife until it was in their back. So I made a choice. I wasn't going to be another name in his trail of ghosts. I began building a new identity. Nothing illegal, just untraceable. New email, new phone, cash only life. I learned how to dig through data leaks, how to follow corporate filings and cross reference offshore registrations. Every night I found a new thread, and every morning I followed it. My empathy, once a wound, became a weapon. I could think like him now, cold, deliberate, methodical. Daniel taught me how to disappear. Now I'd use that lesson to find him. I didn't leave my old life behind. I buried it. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about survival. My apartment was small and nondescript, perfect for someone who wanted to be invisible. I shredded old mail, changed my phone number, created a new email under a pseudonym. Even my social media accounts vanished, leaving no digital trace. Then I found work. Remote consulting, mostly for small startups, a job that paid enough to cover rent and groceries. It was quiet, low stakes, and completely disconnected from the corporate world that had once destroyed me. The clients didn't care about my past, they only cared about results. And I delivered. While I rebuilt myself externally, my mind worked on a different track. Daniel. I spent hours digging through networks, tracing financial transactions, monitoring obscure corporate filings, and cross referencing data that most people would overlook. He had vanished publicly, but men like him leave patterns. The names change, the addresses shift, but the habits remain. It didn't take long to find a thread. A series of small consulting engagements, an alias that was too precise to be accidental, a social media account he hadn't fully erased. His online presence was minimal, professional, but familiar. That meticulous, controlled tone he always used. And then I saw her, a woman in her mid 30s, smiling in a photograph on a company site, candid, friendly, unsuspecting. I didn't know her name at first, only the role she played in Daniel's new life. Target. The same methods, the same patterns I had fallen for were now being applied to someone else. It made my blood run cold, but it also sharpened my focus. This wasn't just personal anymore, it was systematic. I documented everything: her meetings, the small public mentions in newsletters, the consulting projects she was assigned. I watched Daniel carefully, noting patterns in his communications, the subtle ways he insinuated himself into professional spaces, how he engineered situations that forced trust. It was a lesson in manipulation, a dark mirror of everything I had endured. But this time, I would not be a passive observer. Under my new identity, I started interacting with him indirectly. Anonymous emails, innocuous professional inquiries, traces of data I knew he would notice. He responded naturally. His instincts hadn't dulled. He believed in his invincibility. And in doing so, he revealed pieces of himself: locations, routines, habits. Every detail I collected added to a map I was building. A map not for escape, but for confrontation. I worked slowly, deliberately, keeping my distance. Every night after completing client work, I'd cross reference my findings, verifying patterns, connecting dots. Rebuilding my life wasn't just about employment or social appearances, it was about reclaiming power. For months, I lived in duality, one part of me blending seamlessly into ordinary existence, another consumed by the meticulous, almost obsessive reconstruction of Daniel's trail. And with every discovery, every small confirmation that he was targeting another unsuspecting woman, my empathy, the part of me that had once been exploited, hardened into something else: precision, clarity, resolve. I didn't feel anger yet, not the hot, impulsive kind. This was colder, deeper, a patient focus that would outlast him. I had rebuilt myself for survival, and now I was rebuilding for justice. I knew that rushing in would ruin everything. Daniel thrived on control, on predicting people's reactions. I couldn't afford to make a single misstep. So I began slowly, quietly, like a shadow in the corner of someone else's life. First, her, the woman Daniel had been grooming. Let's call her Emma. I created a persona that was believable, a distant acquaintance from a previous professional project, someone she might have met briefly at a conference or workshop. Nothing too close, nothing that would raise suspicion. I let her think she was reconnecting with someone from the past. Messages were subtle at first, casual greetings, comments about industry trends, small notes of encouragement. Nothing personal, nothing alarming. I watched how she responded, what she shared, where she let her guard down. Each reply built a profile in my mind, her interests, her routines, the way she trusted without hesitation. Meanwhile, I began the digital part. Under my new identity, I engaged Daniel online. I sent messages through the professional account I had created, asking innocuous questions about consulting practices, commenting on industry posts, maintaining a tone he would recognize: polite, interested, slightly deferential. I wanted him to believe he was still in control, that he was still untouchable. With Emma, the strategy was different. I planted tiny seeds of doubt. Isn't it strange how he only reaches out when he needs something? I'd write. Or, sometimes people you think you know best can surprise you, not always in good ways. I never mentioned him by name at first. That would come later, once trust was firmly established. She responded cautiously. At first, she laughed off my comments, but then, slowly, I noticed the pauses in her messages, the small questions she started asking me about people and situations. The first time she asked, "Do you know anyone who's ever been hurt by Daniel?" My heart clenched. That was my opening. From there, I fed her tiny, verifiable hints. A news article about a fraud case he'd quietly been linked to years ago. A LinkedIn connection that didn't match up with his professional claims. Each piece of information carefully curated to be factual yet suggestive. Emma began to confide in me. She shared experiences that mirrored my own: subtle manipulations, flattery, guilt tripping, isolation from friends. Every detail I remembered all too well. It was painful, yes, but necessary. I had to immerse myself in the narrative to guide her safely without revealing myself too soon. At the same time, Daniel continued to operate as usual, unaware that his past was now quietly converging with his present. My messages under the new identity were just visible enough to make him think I was another colleague or admirer, someone harmless, professional, a distraction he could control. It was a delicate balance. Too fast, and Emma might suspect; too obvious, and Daniel might detect my presence. But patience was my advantage. He had taught me how carefully to observe, how to plan, and I was now using his own methods against him. Every night I reviewed my notes, cross referenced timelines, and planned my next steps. Emma's trust was growing. Daniel's ego remained unchallenged. All that remained was to continue tightening the threads until I could pull them with precision. This wasn't about vengeance yet. Not openly. It was about preparation, building the narrative so that when the time came, Daniel would walk right into the trap I had designed. And I would be ready. Daniel had always believed he could read people like open books: confident, charming, meticulous. He thought nothing could escape his notice. But he had never met me this way: distant, meticulous, invisible, and patient. Under my new identity, I became exactly what he expected: polite, professional, slightly deferential, someone who admired his intelligence but never challenged him. Every message I sent online reinforced his sense of control. Every carefully worded compliment, every strategic question lured him further into the illusion. He began trusting me, slowly, casually, almost unconsciously. His responses were open, almost familiar, as if he were speaking to an ally he could manipulate without fear. I saved everything. Every word, every subtle boast, every veiled threat he thought was private was now cataloged. At the same time, I continued my careful guidance of Emma. I let her vent, shared small truths about manipulation, never naming Daniel, but allowing her intuition to sense the danger. Each warning was subtle, so she would not panic but remain aware, alert to patterns I knew would emerge. I remember one evening clearly. Daniel had sent a long message detailing his new projects, the clients he had acquired, and even the occasional ethical shortcuts he'd taken. The casual arrogance in his tone was exquisite, like watching a predator brag about its kill. I copied every line, every timestamp, every digital trace, saving them in encrypted folders I accessed only from secure devices. Emma sent a message that night, too. I'm worried. Sometimes he seems too perfect. I don't know if I can trust my instincts. I replied carefully. Trust your instincts. They're more reliable than any charm. Take notes, observe, and never be alone with him if something feels off. Her trust in me had grown so that she followed my advice, not knowing who I really was. I watched as the protective instinct, the same one Daniel had exploited in me, awakened in her. And I realized she would survive this because of my guidance. Meanwhile, Daniel's messages became more revealing. He complained about his team, shared personal vulnerabilities, and even hinted at misdeeds he'd never admit in person. Each piece of evidence was another thread I could pull, another trap I could eventually set. I laughed softly one night, alone in my apartment, as I read his latest message. He didn't suspect a thing. He thought he had control, that he was clever, that he had evaded consequences once before. And he was right, up to a point. But I was watching him now, learning him in ways no one else could. It was intoxicating, this dual life. One half of me was publicly invisible, working quietly and rebuilding my reputation under another name. The other half was consumed by careful, deliberate planning, studying the man who had ruined my life, and plotting a reckoning so precise that he wouldn't even see it coming. The turning point was clear. I wasn't just observing, I was gathering power. Every message he sent under false confidence became ammunition. Every interaction with Emma reinforced my ability to predict his next move. And most importantly, I was no longer the woman he had destroyed. I was the architect of what came next. I had waited for this moment for months, meticulously building the evidence I needed. Every email, every falsified invoice, every message where Daniel boasted about manipulating someone, it was all there, cataloged, time-stamped, impossible to deny. I started quietly, approaching the authorities first. Not the usual investigators who had failed me before, but a specialized financial crimes unit. I sent them a carefully encrypted folder with everything: documents from my time working with him, copies of his new communications, and a detailed account of his past fraudulent activities. I included my own statements, concise and factual. No dramatics, just the truth. It was enough to get their attention. They began cross-referencing, confirming patterns I had painstakingly mapped. Every lead I had dug up from Daniel's aliases, offshore accounts, and shell corporations fell into place like pieces of a puzzle. Next, the media. I contacted a reporter who had covered white-collar crime before, someone reputable and careful, I offered an exclusive, all the details, all the evidence, with the assurance that sources would remain anonymous. They were skeptical at first, but the documents were airtight. The story broke quietly at first, an online expose with concrete proof, dates, and connections. Then the final piece, his employer. I sent an anonymous tip directly to the compliance department, including evidence that Daniel's financial maneuvers were illegal and that he had a documented history of using women to cover his tracks. Within days, the dominoes fell. His company froze his accounts and revoked access to clients. The authorities issued warrants under both his new and old identities. And the media story went viral. Headlines calling him a serial con artist, an exploiter of trust, a manipulator of women's compassion. I watched from my quiet apartment as his carefully constructed life crumbled. Social media profiles vanished, professional contacts reached out in shock, and even those who had once admired him now recoiled. His arrogance, his meticulous planning, all undone by the meticulous work of the woman he had underestimated. Emma reached out a week later. Her voice trembled over the phone. I can't believe it. I thought I was the only one. I smiled softly. You weren't, and you're safe now. Even the authorities were impressed by the thoroughness of the documentation. They told me it was one of the clearest cases they had ever handled, thanks to the detailed evidence and the timeline I had constructed. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. The satisfaction wasn't in watching him fall, though I admit it was sweet. It was in knowing that I had taken control of a narrative that had once left me powerless. I spent weeks reviewing every step, every message, every move, to ensure there was nothing missing. Daniel had been clever, but I had been smarter. He had counted on underestimating me, counting on the very qualities he had exploited. Now, those qualities had become the instruments of his downfall. The world outside continued, oblivious to my own quiet victories, but inside, I felt a sense of completion. Daniel's web of deceit, built over years and strengthened by the trust he had stolen, was finally unraveled. For the first time in months, I slept without the gnawing tension at the back of my skull. Justice, it seemed, could be quiet, deliberate, and absolute, just like I had always imagined it. And though Daniel's empire lay in ruins, I knew one thing clearly. This was not the end. It was the point where I finally began reclaiming everything that had been taken from me. I knew it was only a matter of time. People like Daniel don't fade quietly, they lash out, especially when they realize the trap they've walked into. It started with a message. At first, I thought it was a mistake. An email from a blocked account, a subject line that made my stomach tighten. We need to talk. I opened it cautiously. The text was short, urgent. Lena, I know it's you. You've ruined everything. How? Who told you? This isn't over. For a moment, a flicker of the old panic rose in my chest. Then I remembered the months of preparation, the silent hours, the evidence meticulously gathered. The woman who had cried alone in her apartment, who had been publicly humiliated, was gone. This woman, the one Daniel had underestimated, was different. He called the number I had used to communicate with Emma. His voice was furious, shaking with a kind of desperation that comes from losing control completely. I know you're behind this. You think you can just ruin me and walk away? I didn't answer at first. Let him speak. Let him reveal himself. Every word, every tremor, every miscalculated threat was a piece of the puzzle I'd been waiting for. You don't understand. You don't know what you've done to me, he yelled. I leaned back, calm, measured. I do, I said quietly. I remember everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every person you hurt to get what you wanted. I watched you carefully. I documented it all. You left me no choice. There was a pause on the other end, then a low laugh, bitter and strained. You you think this is revenge? You don't know what you're messing with. I can fix this. I can make you regret this. But I didn't flinch. I had rebuilt myself with the care of someone assembling a machine of inevitability. He was angry, but his fury was now predictable. I had studied him long enough to know how he would react. Try, I said. Go ahead, manipulate, threaten. But this time, it won't work. I'm not the same woman who trusted you. I could hear his breathing, harsh and uneven, as if he were trying to pull back the storm he couldn't stop. And I realized he wasn't just angry, he was scared. He had always believed he could control everything, and now he could control nothing. Over the next days, the calls and messages continued. He tried charm, then guilt, then threats, cycling through the patterns he knew I would recognize. Each attempt was recorded, every word stored. He was leaving evidence of his own downfall, thinking he could reclaim some of his old power. I responded only when necessary, in careful, neutral tones that revealed nothing, confirmed nothing. Each interaction was a lesson in observation, patience, and control. By the time I ended the last call, Daniel was no longer a man with power over me. He was a man stripped bare, exposed for what he truly was: a manipulator, a fraud, and a predator who had underestimated the one person he thought he could break. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not vengeance in its rawest form, just a sense of completion. The reckoning had arrived, but it was different from what he expected. He had returned, believing he could regain control. I had returned, knowing I never would again. The cafe was quiet, almost empty. Rain tapped gently against the windows, softening the world outside while sharpening the tension inside. I arrived early, sitting at a corner table, nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold before I even took a sip. He walked in 15 minutes late, of course, confident that he could command the room with a smile, with charm, with the aura of control he always carried. I watched him pause when he saw me, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I glimpsed surprise, the faint flicker of recognition that I was no longer the same woman. Lena, he said, sliding into the seat across from me, voice smooth but edged with tension. It's good to see you. I nodded politely. Hello, Daniel. He leaned back, scanning my face as if trying to read something hidden there. I let him. I didn't need to speak. He wanted a reaction, a clue, any sign that he still held power. I gave him none. The waiter came and left. The rain pattered. We sat in silence long enough that it became a tangible presence, wrapping around us, pressing against our shoulders. I could feel his impatience growing, like a predator realizing the prey it has stalked for months is now fully alert. Finally, he spoke. I I didn't expect you to find me. I sipped my tea slowly. You underestimated me. That's your first mistake. He laughed, a low, uneasy sound. I've made mistakes before. I've recovered. Yes, I said, voice calm, precise. And each time someone else paid the price, not this time. His gaze sharpened, scanning for weakness, a crack in my armor. There was none. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. Each second was a statement. Each heartbeat told him he was no longer in control. He tried to charm, to manipulate subtly, offering explanations, excuses, half apologies that were actually just veiled attempts to regain influence. I listened, noting every tactic, every word, storing them silently. But I didn't react. I didn't counter. I just watched, let him flounder. "You've changed," he said finally, voice tight. "You're different." I smiled faintly, a cold, measured curve of the lips. I had to change, or I would have lost everything. There was a pause. I could see his mind racing, weighing options, considering old patterns, old strategies, all useless now. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I didn't beg. I didn't plead. Instead, I let him feel the truth in silence, that he had no leverage left, that his carefully constructed world had collapsed, and that the person he once thought weak and vulnerable had become something he could never control. "You won't get mercy from me," I said finally, letting the words settle like a weight on the table. "Not now, not ever. Everything you built, everything you've manipulated, it's over, and it's your own fault." He stared at me, a mixture of fury, disbelief, and fear crossing his features. For the first time, I realized he understood fully that the game he had always played, controlling, deceiving, exploiting, had turned against him irrevocably. I stood, leaving my cup untouched, leaving him with nothing but the cold realization of his defeat. No words could undo it, no charm could reclaim it. And as I walked out into the rain, I felt something I hadn't in years, a quiet, unshakable sense of power. Not vengeance for its own sake, but the clarity that comes from finally being free. Daniel stayed behind, staring into the empty cup, the silence of the cafe echoing the emptiness he had created for himself. And I walked away. I expected relief. When Daniel was finally arrested, handcuffed, escorted through the courthouse doors, exposed as a serial manipulator and fraudster, I thought the weight pressing on my chest for years would lift. I thought I would finally feel free. I didn't. Standing in the balcony of my small apartment that evening, I watched the city lights blink through the rain, each one a reflection of a life that had gone on while mine had been paused. The world had moved, and I had spent years in a shadow, meticulously plotting, silently hunting, controlling every detail. Every step, every calculated message, every interaction with Emma. It had all been about him, about Daniel, about revenge. And now he was gone, confined by bars and law, but I realized I had changed. I had become someone I barely recognized. The woman who once trusted, who once gave freely of herself, who once believed in the innate goodness of people. She was gone. In her place stood a version of me forged in months of silent observation, careful manipulation, and cold calculation. The empathy I once valued had become a tool. The kindness I once offered had been weaponized. The line between justice and vengeance had blurred. I had told myself I was only righting a wrong, exposing a predator, saving another woman from suffering. And that was true, but the satisfaction I felt wasn't purely justice. It was also the result of carefully orchestrated control, the thrill of being one step ahead, the quiet power of seeing him unravel while I remained untouchable. I thought of Emma, who was safe now, unaware of the depth of what I had done to protect her. I had guided her, yes, but I had done so with a ruthlessness I could not ignore. My hands had become clean in the eyes of the law, but my mind remembered every moment I had played the game, every subtle manipulation, every lie told in service of my plan. And I realized that relief and satisfaction could coexist with unease. I was free of Daniel's control, yes, but bound now to the choices I had made. I tried to remind myself that it was necessary, that without my intervention, he would have continued his pattern, damaging more lives. But that didn't erase the hollow feeling that sometimes in the quiet of the night, I was no longer entirely the person I used to be. Revenge had a cost, not legal, not material, but internal. It left a scar on the psyche, a subtle reshaping of identity. I had paid that price willingly, yet was still staggering to feel it fully. For the first time in years, I wondered what I had lost in the pursuit of what I believed was right. I had reclaimed my life, yes, but I had also become a shadow of the woman who had once laughed freely, trusted openly, and hoped without calculation. And as the city lights flickered below, I understood the truth. Freedom is rarely pure. Sometimes it comes wrapped in the residue of what you had to become to survive. Daniel was behind bars. Justice, in the eyes of the world, had been served. But inside me, the echo of vengeance lingered, a constant reminder that survival, power, and justice are not always the same thing. And perhaps I thought quietly that was the real cost. Months had passed since Daniel's arrest. The public attention had faded, the news cycle moved on, and life outside my apartment continued without interruption. Yet the echoes of what had happened lingered in me. The lessons, the scars, the quiet knowledge of how fragile trust could be. I started to work with other victims of manipulation, women and men who had been charmed, deceived, and left hollow by people who knew exactly how to exploit compassion. I didn't broadcast my own story. I offered guidance quietly, listening more than I spoke, helping them see patterns I had learned to recognize. I became a kind of shadow mentor, teaching vigilance without fear, patience without rage. Sometimes, when I sat with them in small rooms or over coffee, I would see the flicker of recognition, the same shock, the same hurt I had once carried. I could feel it because I had lived it. I could guide them through it, not with the fire of vengeance, but with the cool clarity of survival. And yet, at night, when the city outside went quiet, when the world outside my window blurred into darkness, I would think of Daniel. His face, his arrogance, the precise cruelty of his manipulations. It never fully left me. I had defeated him, yes, but I knew the truth. Mercy and justice were not always aligned. Sometimes showing compassion too early allows the predator to regroup, to move unseen, to strike again. I often reminded the people I helped: observe, learn, protect yourself, trust, but verify. And never forget the lessons the world teaches you, harsh as they may be. And I understood that the hardest part wasn't finding him or even exposing him. It was learning to live with what I had become in the process. I had wielded patience like a blade, empathy like a tool, and silence like armor. I had become methodical, calculated, relentless. The woman I had been before all of this, trusting, naive, open hearted, existed only in memory. Yet, there was a strange satisfaction in that. I could see the world clearly now, stripped of illusions, and I could help others navigate it without losing themselves completely. That was my new purpose, my new form of justice. One evening, as I closed the files of a client I had helped avoid a dangerous partner, I paused by the window and looked at the lights flickering across the city. I whispered quietly to myself, "They say mercy makes you human, but sometimes mercy only feeds the wolves." And in that moment, I understood that strength was not just in surviving or even in revenge. It was in knowing when to act, when to withhold, and when to transform pain into something that could protect rather than destroy. I had carried the weight of vengeance. Now I carried the weight of mercy. And it was heavier, infinitely heavier, but ultimately it made me whole.